Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our commemorative event on the life and legacy of Boris Nemtsov. I'm Cory Welt, the Associate Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Elliott School and co-director of our PONARS Eurasia Policy Program. Just over 1 year has passed since the death of former Russian government official, parliamentary deputy, opposition leader, and social activist Boris Nemtsov, who was shot to death in the heart of Moscow on February 27, 2015. While 5 alleged gunmen, including members of Chechen law enforcement, were arrested and are to stand trial, this act left Russian society with more questions than answers. To paraphrase one contributor from the volume that we are introducing at this event, Spanish professor of journalism Miguel Vázquez-Liñán, it is a sad fact that in contemporary Russia, it is so simple to find someone willing to pull the trigger, yet so complicated to conclude a criminal investigation. Unfortunately, Nemtsov's murder was just one in a line of violent crimes against journalists, activists, and others who have spoken out harshly against the Russian government. Our event this evening focuses not on Nemtsov's murder, but his life and place in Russia's political history. Nemtsov had many like-minded allies, supporters, admirers, and friends in Russia and outside, including in this city. It is also true that not everyone who disagreed with the Russian government necessarily agreed with his beliefs, policies, or tactics. But again, to borrow from Liñán, in a context of conspiratorial silence and sycophancy, the courage of politicians like Boris Nemtsov is nowadays essential so as to be able to look to the future in Russia with at least some degree of optimism. It's my great pleasure to introduce our 3 speakers and my close colleagues. First, we have Professor Robert Orttung, Research Director of the GW Sustainability Collaborative and Associate Research Professor of International Affairs at the Elliott School. He's the managing editor of our journal Demokratizatsiya, the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization, as well as co-editor of the Russian Analytical Digest and the Caucasus Analytical Digest. Professor Ortung's a visiting fellow at the Center for Security Studies at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich as well, and he's authored or edited a number of volumes on Russian politics and energy, as well as the forthcoming volume Beyond the Euromaidan, Comparative Perspectives on Reform in Ukraine, together with our colleague Henry Hale. Professor Andrey Makarychev comes to us all the way from the University of Tartu in Estonia, and he's the guest editor of our special issue of Demokratizatsiya on Nemtsov. Professor Makarychev is visiting professor at the Johann Schutte Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu. He also teaches at the Institute for East European Studies of the Free University of Berlin and is a senior research associate at CDAB in Barcelona. He was formerly a professor of international relations at the Linguistic University of Nizhny Novgorod, the town where Boris Nemtsov originally made his political career. Professor Makarychev is the author of Russia and the EU in a Multipolar World and co-editor of Russia's Changing Economic and Political Regimes and the forthcoming sports mega-events in post-Soviet Eurasia. Finally, Professor Hale is professor of political science and international affairs here at GW and co-director of PONARS Eurasia. Professor Hale's work focuses on issues of politics, public opinion, and identity in Russia and post-Soviet Eurasia. He's the author of a trio of trend-setting volumes in our discipline, Patronal Politics, Eurasian Regime Dynamics and Comparative Perspective, The Foundations of Ethnic Politics, Separatism of States and Nations in Eurasia and the World, and Why Not Parties in Russia, Democracy, Federalism, and the State. He's also co-editor of Developments in Russian Politics and the aforementioned volume on Ukrainian reform. And he also chairs the editorial board of our journal Demokratizatsiya. Thank you very much again for joining us. I look forward to a very stimulating panel. First, we'll have Professor Orttung.
Use this great event to promote one of my publications, which is something that he would obviously do, starting with the Sochi Olympics and other things, but grab a platform. But of course, that publication is the journal about Nemtsov, and Andrey was actually the real driving force behind the issue, pulling together a lot of the articles and organizing it. And my role was just to get it from the pile of papers into something between 2 covers. So that was very interesting. But what I want to do is highlight some of the more interesting articles here. And I think Cory forgot to mention that the journal itself is available for free or any donation you feel inspired to make to support the editorial staff and their time. but we have plenty of issues over there on the side. And it doesn't look like a lot, but there's more hidden away somewhere. So there's plenty. There's enough for everybody. But so let me tell you what you might find if you start reading through some of these articles. And of course, the most interesting thing is that Nemtsov started his career, of course, in Nizhny Novgorod as a very young reformer. And so if you were a big fan of governors during the 1990s, Nemtsov was one of the stars. He was one who was promoting reform at the very local level and gained a lot of attention. He had Margaret Thatcher come to visit him, Bill Clinton, lots of other folks dropped in to see what was going on. So in her article for the issue, Tamila Lankina, professor at the London School of Economics, poses the question of whether there's something special about the region of Nizhny Novgorod that generated this kind of reform spirit, or if it was really the dynamic personality and energy of Nemtsov that pushed forward the reform. And so she has a very interesting analysis of sort of this traditional, great man in history question. Is it the man? Is it the times? Or is it, the location? Is there something in the water in Nizhny Novgorod that somehow makes it a dynamic place? Obviously that dynamism isn't as apparent now that Nemtsov is gone or is not so prominent on the stage. But so Lankina sort of comes to the expected answer that it's a little bit of both, but she does comes to this conclusion, very interesting discussion of what, sort of the history of Nizhny Novgorod and what makes it interesting and special among the more than 80 Russian regions, and also looking a little bit at Nemtsov's character. But while her article is relatively laudatory of Nemtsov's efforts, some of the other writers who contributed their impressions, people who knew Nemtsov at different parts of his career, were much more critical. And so there's a very interesting short article by Howard Wiarda, who a very well-known scholar in political science, who unfortunately passed away last summer, shortly after writing this contribution, I think. But he was much more critical in his analysis of Nemtsov and his contribution in Nizhny Novgorod. And so he, for example, had spent time in Nizhny in the early 90s and was there and looked around at the city and came to the conclusion that even though there was a lot of hype around Nemtsov's ability to support small business, there wasn't actually a lot of small business developing there. And in fact, in many cases, the local political administration was cracking down on those small businesses. And so he described Nemtsov as somebody who was boyish in his enthusiasms and suggested that Nemtsov saw things in a rather simplistic manner. And we attributed that to Nemtsov's career as a physicist. So the physicists sort of see things as very, they don't understand, I guess, from this point of view, the essence of politics and how complicated it is. Which makes me feel good because my dad is a chemist, and he always told me that any science with the word science in it is not a science. Of course, referring to political science. So it's nice to see the tables turned and the natural scientists taking pot shots at the social scientists taking pot shots at the natural scientists. So then I have. So after Nizhny, of course, got out of. That's okay, but we want to. Back two. Actually, yes. So we'll just stick with this one for a minute. After Nizhny, of course, was where Nemtsov made his name, and then at the height of his career, Yeltsin actually brought Nemtsov to Moscow, where he served as the first deputy prime minister. And in the article, there's a very long biographical article that starts off the issue by Andrey Momin, and he describes this part of Nemtsov's life in very interesting ways. At that point, sort of in the mid-90s, it seemed like Nemtsov was the person most likely to succeed Yeltsin, and he was making a big name for himself in the government. I remember at that time I was actually working in Prague, and what sort of is Radio Liberty, but was then called the Open Media Research Institute, which is a long, complicated story. But he made a very big name for himself by throwing all the bureaucrats out of their foreign limousines and was forcing them to buy local cars, which of course came from Nizhny Novgorod. So he was very good populist leader, and he seemed like he was going to be the next president. But then, of course, the 1998 financial crisis came along, and Nemtsov had to leave office. And so that's when he became the opposition leader that we sort of know him as more recently, ever since Putin. And what's interesting is that from the very beginning, even before Putin was elected, Nemtsov was already in opposition to him. And even when some of Nemtsov's closest allies, like Sergei Kirienko, who had been the prime minister and who was another one from Nizhny Novgorod, even though people like Kirienko, who's still in a very powerful position, sort of seen as a Putinist, when those liberals went to back Putin in the very beginning and supported him, Nemtsov was always opposed, and he wanted to be sure that there was pursuit of liberal policies. And so as the opposition leader, he of course has taken on some of the most difficult questions in Russian society. Of course, the corruption surrounding the Sochi Olympics, which Andrey has a very interesting article about, Russia's invasions of Ukraine, and of course the nature of the Kadyrov leadership in Chechnya, which seems to be the most difficult question facing Russia today. So in one of her articles that's included in the volume, Yulia Kernashova, a Ukrainian academic, says that if Nemtsov were alive today, his place would be in Ukraine. Though I think if he were in Ukraine at the moment, he would be just out on the streets too, protesting all the corruption surrounding the Poroshenko government and what's going on there. So I think even if he were there, and I'm sure Nemtsov, if he were living in America, would have plenty of stuff to do around here as well as an opposition leader. And so, in conclusion, I wanted to point out two of the most powerful tributes, I think, in the issue to Nemtsov come from David Kramer, who's now former head of Freedom House, who's now at the McCain Institute, just down the street here, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was a very close friend of Nemtsov, and is now working at Khodorkovsky's Open Russia movement, and is one of the leaders of the People's Freedom Party, PONARS. Those guys, to me, seem very like-minded, along with Nemtsov. And so Kramer describes Nemtsov as a true Russian patriot, who, and if you read his essay, which I found very moving, because he says, don't give up on Russia. There's still hope. We have to support the democratic forces there. And I was thinking, well, it's probably time to give up hope on Russia, but after I read Kramer, I decided there's still hope, so we'll just keep fighting and keep working, just like Nemtsov would have wanted us to. So I thought that was a very interesting essay. And Kara-Murza, of course, who spent a lot of time with Nemtsov and did a lot of things with him, describes him as a white crow in Russia, using the typical Russian language expression. And the thing that made Nemtsov different from all of his colleagues was that he always fought for his principles rather than political expediency. So it was heartening to see, actually, on the last slide, I think that's a good segue into Andrey's presentation, that just a week ago in Moscow, about 30,000 people, depending whose numbers you believe, came out to remember Nemtsov. So it does show that even in the darkest days of Russian autocracy, there's still people who are willing to go out on the street in support of him. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Andrey, and then to Henry, of course, to talk about, who can more fully explain Nemtsov's contributions to democracy in Russia.
Thank you. Well, since originally I'm from Nizhny Novgorod, I'm supposed to start with something more personal. And of course, it's obvious that the news about his death was shocking for all of my friends and colleagues, and that was one of the most traumatic experiences that I have ever had in my life. But there was a second kind of shocking experience, which in fact triggered the whole idea of this special issue, and it was my very brief conversation with a colleague of mine from Russia, when I was asking him, and he was from Nizhny Novgorod, when I was asking him what people in Nizhny think about the murder of Nemtsov. The answer was that it's only for you in Estonia that Nemtsov matters. We completely forget about him. We don't know who he was. And of course, that immediately made me think that we should do something to commemorate this outstanding person and to kind of help or to contribute to inscribing his name into the contemporary history of Russia. And I think not only of Russia, because of course he left political traces in countries like Ukraine, for example. And one of my personal experiences of observing how Nemtsov is commemorated exactly 1 year after his murder came from Stockholm, when I have been on the 27th of February. If someone can help me with this picture. So we have spontaneously gathered like 30-40 people from different backgrounds, and what we did, we just decorated all bridges in Stockholm with this Nemtsov most, and that was a kind of very spontaneous, commemorative action that turned Stockholm into a city of commemoration. And I think it's one of the interesting examples of how people, simple people, either from Russia or from other countries, they do remember Nemtsov, they do commemorate, and they do pay tribute to his contribution to the Russian democracy, not only in the city of Nizhny Novgorod, but on the federal level as well. Coming back to his Nizhny Novgorod experience at the start of his career, a couple of names that Bob has already mentioned, Howard Viarde and Andrey Maman. In fact, they were the first two scholars from the West, from the real West, one from the States, another from Amsterdam, from the Netherlands, who visited Nizhny Novgorod in the very beginning of 1990s when Nemtsov was the governor, and who kind of helped us, I would say the first post-Soviet generation of political scientists and international relations experts in widening our horizons and kind of connecting and reconnecting us to the international academic milieu. And this brings me to a very important point, which I think has a very clear political resonance. For me, the whole decade of 1990s was not kind of a time of troubles, which would be definitely part of the Putin's perception and Putin's characterization of 1990s. For me, it was a time of opportunities, and I think it's very important to inscribe the name of Boris Nemtsov into this decade that gave freedom to the whole generation of my compatriots in Russia. In my presentation, which I will partly base on what I have written in my co-authored paper with Alexander Yatsik, I will refer to his public discourse and his public campaigning related to the Sochi Olympics, which in my view is one of the most interesting cases of public critique and raising the whole set of issues related to this mega event. But I will definitely also discuss some issues that stretch far beyond this event and that deal with the issues of sovereignty and the nature of Putin's rule in general. So, two questions will be central for my analysis. One is how can we speak about Nemtsov in more or less academic terms? Basically, the debate or the discourse about Nemtsov is very emotional. It's very much politically driven. I remember a colleague of mine who immediately after his death said something like, "One fake macho killed a real one," and that betrays the whole, emotional, background of the debates of Nemtsov and his life and his murder. My intention in this paper, our intention in this paper, was to try to think about Nemtsov's contribution to the Russian political system and the Russian democracy in more analytical and more academic perspective, which is not that often in Russia so far, but I do think that Nemtsov can be remembered as someone who contributed to the evolution of Russian political system, and his contribution can be analyzed in academic terms and from academic perspective. And the second question, which I would also like to briefly discuss, is more related to kind of more contemporary events and developments after his death. And I would like to share with you some of my ideas on what would Nemtsov say about the most recent debate on sports and politics in Russia, taking into account the forthcoming FIFA 2018 World Cup and the whole story of corruption in this institution. So why Sochi? What was the driving argument, and why Sochi was, in our view, important as an interesting case study for commemorating the political activity of Nemtsov? Well, first of all, there is a formal explanation. Nemtsov ran for mayor in Sochi when the Sochi was already preparing for hosting the Olympics, and that's an important kind of element of his political career. Secondly, the Sochi Olympics is known, widely known, not as just a celebration, not as just a mega event, but also as a case for exorbitant corruption and mismanagement, even admitted by the president himself. So that's an interesting element of the way how Russia manages this mega event business. And a third argument would be that Sochi, the Sochi Olympics, was expected to kind of celebrate Russian soft power. Each second article about Sochi was mostly about expectations of Russian soft power being the most important element of Russian diplomacy, Russian foreign policy. Which, as seen from post-Sochi perspective, looks a little bit questionable, because what we have after Sochi was annexation of Crimea, economic sanctions, many Russian officials on travel ban, growing financial instability, financial troubles, which are definitely directly related to the military conflict with Ukraine. So we do have this kind of rupture between this celebratory narrative of Sochi as something that would allegedly make Russia a different country and the harsh reality on the ground. So I will start with some ideas that can be used for more or less academic analysis of Boris Nemtsov's life and his contribution to the political debate in Russia. And the starting point for our analysis is that Nemtsov, as a political leader, has to be deployed, has to be placed in a very, I would say, complicated political milieu, which would combine mainstream or the dominant discourse and the opposition discourse, a non-mainstream discourse. And the role of Nemtsov, despite the fact that he was one of the leaders of anti-Putin opposition, the role of Nemtsov and his positioning at this kind of intersection of, let's say, hegemonic and counter-hegemonic discourse was, I would say, precarious and even shaky. So his legacy has to be analyzed at the intersection of these two discourses. On the one hand, yes, he was a leader of anti-Putin opposition, but on the other hand, and the case of his contribution to debating the Sochi Olympics made it quite clear that he positioned himself as a very experienced regional politician. A governor in Nizhny Novgorod, and then a member of the regional legislature in Yaroslav Oblast, and as a foreign policy, as a federal policy maker. So he had a kind of double identity, which makes him a very interesting object of academic research. One more interesting thing was that Nemtsov was not against Sochi Olympics in the general sense. He said that yes, we are in favor of hosting Sochi Olympics, but in the meantime, he raised a number of financial and economic issues that, in my view, made his claim about Sochi Olympics explicitly political. Nevertheless, if we take a closer look at the structure of his discourse and on what he said about Sochi Olympics, he never seriously touched social issues related to the Sochi Olympics, like, for example, mass-scale evictions or issues of environmental protection. They were not in his agenda for some reason. He was completely silent on something which was a matter of a big debate here in the West, including in the States, the issues of LGBT community in Russia. He did not say a word about that. So his main focus was on corruption, on mismanagement, and exorbitant price for this 2-week celebration of Russian patriotism and Russian kind of great power narrative. Russian come back to the club of great powers. And that's what we have in our article. We claim that his anti-corruption corruption campaign and his anti-corruption narrative is deeply political. The question is why? What is political in his campaigning? And there are at least two answers to this question. First of all, Nemtsov's narrative is political because he contested one of the main pillars of Putin's discourse and Putin's system of rule. And this is about setting the criteria of inclusion and exclusion from the political community named Russia. And secondly, Nemtsov explicitly contested the rule by exception, claiming that the whole Sochi Olympics is about a series of exceptions which are just completely unacceptable for Russia. And these are two things which I would like to briefly discuss. So the first one, on the first account, Nemtsov contested the domestic core of Putin's narrative of being the key source of defining the rules of belonging to the Russian political community by emotionally kind of articulating the idea of patriotism, the idea of nationalism, and the loyalty to the state, which is directly related to these two ideas. For the Kremlin and for Putin personally, the Sochi Olympics was a kind of loyalty test. So if you are against Sochi Olympics, that means that you kind of detach yourself from this collective self of Russia. You kind of put yourself in a very precarious position of someone who criticizes the most important event for the whole country. And that was also part of the Kremlin's narrative, to kind of construct the pro-Putin majority and to differentiate this majority from the minority of these who are labeled as anti-patriotic, pro-Western opposition, the fifth column, etc. So it was a political core in the whole Sochi Sochi interest. And again, this is about criteria of belonging to political community. In this regard, the contribution of Nemtsov was enormous. He claimed that, in fact, you can be a member of this political community without, sharing the dominant attitudes, the dominant narratives, without sharing this pride for the country. In fact, what Nemtsov claimed that instead of producing this, celebratory narrative of Russia coming back to the club of great powers, we need to speak about shame for mismanagement and for exorbitant corruption. And I think this claim was political. The second issue, which I think I'm running out of time. No,
You're fine.
Oh yeah. The second political issue is that Nemtsov was explicitly against the way how the Sochi project was managed by the Kremlin. Claimed that the way how it was managed was constructed on the basis of what might be called sovereign exceptions from the existing rules. And he has a very long list of these exceptions which were legalized by Putin himself. But this is a very interesting thing which in fact is reproduced in other mega events in Russia, including the FIFA 2018 World Cup. So in fact, Putin, by his decrees, he discontinued about a dozen of federal laws because of Sochi Olympics. And this is what Nemtsov raised and made it explicitly part of the public debate, claiming that, in fact, this is unacceptable for democracies. So these extraordinary instruments were heavily criticized by him. And one of his strongest points was that it's not only about Sochi. All those exceptions are about, and this is not a deviation, all those exceptions are about legalizing a model of extra-legal governance that Putin's regime would be eager to reproduce in many other situations. So in fact, it was a kind of warming up exercise for recycling or reproducing the same patterns of governance in different situations. And I would say that Nemtsov was completely right in claiming that, in fact, that's the case in many other situations, including in Moscow, including the cities that are preparing to host the other mega events. Now the second question, which I would like to discuss very briefly in the remaining minutes, is what Nemtsov would say, should he be alive, with us about the most recent developments in this very interesting area related to sports and politics, especially in the anticipation of the FIFA 2018 World Cup and the scandal with corruption in FIFA and other interesting developments. But I will start with something that connects the Sochi Olympics with the annexation of Crimea. And Nemtsov was one of a few Russian opinion makers who said that, in fact, the annexation of Crimea was planned during the Sochi Olympics. So in this sense, he said there is no rupture between Sochi Olympics, the whole logic of Sochi Olympics, and the logic of annexation and the logic of supporting military insurgency in eastern Ukraine. For Nemtsov, that was just elements of one chain. He did not see a rupture between these two things. And in this sense, he was very skeptical about discussing Sochi Olympics as the manifestation of Russian soft power. He was very skeptical and sometimes very cynical about that. He said on a couple of occasions that it's quite logical that after Sochi, Russia annexed Crimea. That was one logical chain. And I would add to this one kind of cultural argument, because Nemtsov was not very strong in using cultural arguments. But I think the cultural arguments here are very important, and they would just strengthen his take on that. If we take a closer look at the opening ceremony of Sochi Olympics, we'll see two very important things. We'll see that Russia openly positioned itself as empire. That's was very clearly stated in the opening ceremony. And Russia positioned itself as kind of a second edition of the Soviet Union, because the story about Russia, the host of the Sochi Olympics, ended before Gorbachev, before Perestroika. Not a single word, not a single scene, not a single image about Russia as such. So Russia thinks about itself in Soviet cultural terms. And that's what was not part of Nemtsov's discourse, but this can be added to this narrative that might help us a little bit, to understand the logic behind Russian policy in Ukraine. Now, concerning the most recent developments, I think that Nemtsov's take on this important linkage between global institutions and authoritarian regimes is very topical for today, because what we have with FIFA is definitely a story of a global sports institution which is very fond of working with, let's say, basically non-democratic regimes, and many of the FIFA officials made it clear. To some extent, and this is also come back to one of Nemtsov's interview. He in fact said that FIFA plays the same role in stabilizing Putin's regime as the International Olympic Committee did, and I think we need to take this argument very seriously. I would also say that it is important to keep in mind that for Nemtsov, the 2018 World Football Cup could be harmful for the economic viability and even the integrity of the whole country, because Nemtsov predicted that Russia can face very strong repercussions of corrupt economy. He even compared Russia with Greece. And we do know that some economic troubles in this country started with mismanaged Olympic Games. So we do need to take into account these predictions, gloomy predictions of Nemtsov quite seriously. And I would also say that should he be alive, should he be with us, he would definitely make a strong case for publicly debating the whole model of sport management in Russia, with rampant doping scandals, which affects many sports federations in Russia. And this is not only about athletes, this is about the policy of the state or the negligence of the state, because most of this sports federation are directly administered and run by governmental officials. The financial and administrative crisis in Russian football industry, in Russian basketball industry, that would only strengthen Nemtsov's argument. And of course, I think that he would claim that the impact of economic sanctions on the future developments in sports mega event industry is very strong. And we can hardly expect success stories from countries that are under economic sanctions in this respect. So what we miss right now is voices of people like Boris Nemtsov, who would make the debate on at least in this area of sports and politics much more topical and much more political in the sense that I have described.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrey, for joining us tonight and for putting together this special issue. And it is remarkable listening to you how many different themes are interwoven into this discussion on the Sochi Olympics and the ideals that Boris Nemtsov fought for. What we want to do now is turn to a broader look at the receptivity to Nemtsov's ideas among the Russian public, and here to discuss his article on the Nemtsov Vote, Public Opinion and Pro-Western Liberalism's Decline in Russia, Professor Hale.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. I'll try to be fairly brief so that we can get to the discussion with all of you. My article in the special issue is focused on how Nemtsov was received by the general public, and in particular, who his supporters were in politics, because I think Nemtsov is understood by many people both within Russia and outside it as one of the leading representatives, and arguably the leading representative for a large period of time in Russia's post-Soviet history, as a representative of what might be called pro-Western liberalism. So sort of an unabashed advocate for good relations with the West, non-conflictual, democracy, human rights, and a strongly market-based economy without much government intervention. So the question is, that I'm looking at, is who were the people that supported him? As we know, support for Nemtsov rose in the 1990s, and to the point where he was regarded as one of the leading contenders for the presidency before the August 1998 financial crisis in particular, I think, hurt him, among some other things. But already by the mid-2000s, his support in presidential polls was already quite low, in the area of 1 or 2%. So there is a question, at what point does it make sense to try and look at who's supporting him? I'm not aware of any opinion polls that were primarily devoted to Nemtsov, so we're left with some questions to analyze that have to do with voting behavior, and when only 1% of the population is saying that they would vote for him, that doesn't leave you much leverage for understanding who those people were. So for this particular piece, I selected a particular point in time to analyze his vote, and I'll get to that in just a minute, and look at survey evidence to try and understand a bit about who supported him, which I think lends us some insight into why we haven't seen a strong pro-Western liberal force in Russia. And I think some of the key findings here, actually I think one of them may be cut off at the very bottom, but one is that Nemtsov's strongest appeal tended to be towards youth and people who are sort of young at heart, if you can put it that way, urbanites, residents of Russia's biggest cities, and self-styled Western, pro-Western Democrats. But interestingly enough, he actually managed to lose out to Putin on some of the most, the largest segment of voters that he could have appealed to, and that would be relatively pro-market voters, and I'll get to that in a moment. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that his political decline preceded Putin to a large degree, and preceded the development certainly of Putin's repressive apparatus. So I don't think that we can blame that, blame sort of his political decline in fortunes, at least for the first part, on Putin's repression. But I think clearly this helped keep things that way later, because he didn't have a chance really to make a comeback given the manipulation in the system that we see. So the approach of the article is to focus on what I've called the pinnacle, the electoral pinnacle of Nemtsov's career. He never appeared as a candidate for the presidency on the ballot, at different points in time deferring to others. But what he did do in the Duma election, the parliamentary election of 2003, was to lead the ticket of the Union of Right Forces, which I use its Russian acronym here of SPS, so he was probably SEAL, in the Duma election of 2003. And so he was the top of the ticket, and the other two who were prominently in the top three, called the Troika, were businesswoman and business association activist Irina Hakamada, and Anatoly Chubais, who is widely known as the sort of the privatization czar in Russia, and actually went on to support Vladimir Putin to a large degree. SPS during this election won 4% of the vote, so it fell just short of the 5% threshold needed for gaining representation in the Russian Duma, at least gaining a full delegation. So this was seen largely as a failing effort. The data that I look at come from the 2003-2004 wave of the Russian Election Studies survey series, which is available for anybody who wants to look at it through the ICPSR, which is an organization at the University of Michigan that archives survey results. And so this was taken right after the December 7th Duma election, and included a representative sample of about 1,600 adult Russian residents, and so a very good sample size that allows us to get some leverage on what was going on. Because you have, for the political scientists in the room, because based on just looking at a binary outcome, did you vote for Nemtsov or not, The model that I use is a logit regression analysis, which is a technique designed to identify, controlling for other factors, which factors tended disproportionately to generate support for Nemtsov, and which did not. And so particularly the numbers that I'm going to present in a minute in graphic form, which will hopefully be understandable, are basically what I want to find out is for a given factor, if we take an otherwise average person and we raise that factor, say age, from its minimum to its maximum value in the data set. So if we take an otherwise average person, first see how likely they would be to vote for Nemtsov if they were 18, then see how likely they would be to vote for Nemtsov at, I think maybe it was like 92 or something, which is the oldest person in the sample. How much difference does that make in a person's likelihood to have been among Nemtsov's voters? So that gives us an estimate of sort of which factors are really working for Nemtsov and which were not. So basically I tried to put them in a graphic form here. And so the little dots are the estimates of the size of the effects. Just for example here, if we take education, we see that people who have higher education were about 2% more likely to vote for Nemtsov than others. And these little wings on the other side of the dot represent a 95% confidence interval. So basically what we want to find out with those wings is, does the 95% confidence interval fall comfortably outside of 0, which is represented by the line? So if the wings intercept the 0 mark, then we can't rule out that this factor had no effect on Nemtsov's vote. So we only really pay attention to ones that we can say with strong confidence worked for, or if they fell to the left of the of 0, worked against Nemtsov. So the first block of factors that I looked at were demographics, and what we see is we find no statistical effect for whether people were located in Siberia or in Russia's more or less depressed south or not. Ethnic Russians appear to be no more or less likely to vote for him, so same thing for ethnic minorities than did others. Gender didn't seem to matter for his vote, but what did seem to matter was he drew significantly from people with higher education. They tended to be more likely to vote for Nemtsov. And people from Russia's largest communities. And the numbers in red are basically to say that people with higher education were about 23% of the electorate at that time. And so people who lived in Russia's largest communities, Russia's largest cities, about 20% lived in those. And then we have the factor of age, which seems to be basically if you're older, you were less likely to vote for Nemtsov. The effect looks very small because it's done by year. So 1 year, this is the effect of 1 year, being 1 year older. You're slightly, less than 1% more likely not to vote for Nemtsov. But what this shows us is that there was an effect. The younger people tended to be significantly likely to vote for Nemtsov. And about 30% of the population at that time that we were looking at in the survey were under age 40. So one of the first factors I'll just call into attention here is that he was drawing support in part from parts of the population that were already relatively small. These were not majority segments of the population, and I think this is a trend that we'll see looking at other factors. So the next part of the analysis looked at at economic factors. And the main conclusion to draw here is that, or to highlight here, is that he did, as he and Chubais and others had originally planned, get the support in the end of people who thought that they had gained economically from the reforms of the 1990s. And so basically they were about 3 to 4% more likely to have voted for Nemtsov than were otherwise average people. But the problem here is that this was only about 13% of the population. The vast majority of people did not think that they had gained from these reforms. And then we also looked at whether or not Nemtsov gained or lost among people who thought that Russia's economy was improving. Because that was one of the things that Nemtsov and his colleagues argued during the campaigns, was that we laid out the fundamental reforms that made possible the economic growth that took place in the 2000s and that Putin was taking credit for. But as we can see, voters basically didn't agree with this. And in fact, I mean, these are basically non-significant results. So he did no better or no worse among people who thought that their own personal pocketbooks were getting fatter, as opposed, and also among people who thought that Russia's economy as a whole were improving. And he also wasn't the candidate of the affluent. So these are people who basically said in a survey that they could afford most basic things without a whole lot of trouble. So we also explored some questions that were in the survey about how people identified themselves. And in part, I wanted to see if people who identified themselves as the middle class were more likely to vote for Nemtsov. Turns out, no more, no less. Same thing with people who identified with small business or big business. So even people who thought that they kind of felt close to the oligarch class didn't see Nemtsov in particular as their representative. But where it did stand out, and this doesn't quite show it, but I can explain why in a minute, but actually this factor of youth, people who identified with the younger generation, were statistically more likely to vote for Nemtsov than others. And so basically kind of a statistical check that I did of that relationship indicates that it was in fact significant. Again, I can elaborate that. But again, the people who identified as youth were only about 32% of the population, and the question was just general. Do you feel close to the younger generation? So interestingly, it seems like there are more people who identify as youth than there were people under 40 in the survey. But that, I think maybe that speaks to Nemtsov himself, who always had a young at heart sort of spirit. And then finally, I wanted to see what kinds of views might be correlated with voting for Nemtsov, at least in this particular election. And again, it's complicated a little bit because there were other people on the ticket, but as the top person on the ticket, he was the most prominent. So this is, I think, as good a test as we can get. We found out that people that thought that Russia should treat the West as a friend, as opposed to a rival or an enemy, or even as an ally, were no more or less likely to vote for Nemtsov. So foreign policy didn't seem to matter much for him. But he did gain support from people who, around 3% more support from people who were for Western democracy. So those people who, if asked, what political regime do you think is best for Russia, and if they said Western democracy, he would get their votes. And this was about 7% of the population. So again, he's winning votes for people who had certain views of his, but only from those that had not a whole lot of adherents in Russia as a whole. Again, people who basically advocated policies favoring very big business, the oligarchs, so didn't want to jail the oligarchs, were no more or less likely to vote for him. Interestingly enough, people who were for a market economy and against a return to socialism were no more or less likely to vote for him. And this really would have been the big prize, and I think this is the set of voters that probably he really would have wanted, and probably expected that these people would be voting for him, especially with Chubais, because they made that advocacy of the market really their core thing. But as we can see, we can't, basically, the result is indistinguishable from this analysis from zero. So he wasn't able to win that. So, let's try to go right here. So just a few conclusions. Nemtsov, as a representative, arguably of pro-Western liberalism, was able to win votes from people systematically among those who considered themselves to be winners from the economic reforms of the 90s, who supported Western democracy, who were both young or felt young at heart, who identified with the younger generation, people in the very biggest cities of Russia, and the most highly educated people. But I think one of the problems for him politically was that these were all relatively small minorities of the population, and especially when they overlap, the intersection of them is relatively small, so it just wasn't a whole lot. And one of the bigger problems was that there were other parties competing for the same sets of voters, and especially for the pro-market voters. So in other survey analysis that I've done, and this shows up, and I talk about this in the article, who was winning the pro-market voters? Well, it turns out it was Vladimir Putin and his United Russia Party. If you were supportive of a market economy, if you identified yourself as being kind of more right of center politically, you were much more likely to vote for United Russia in this very election, and also for Putin in his elections, than you were for other parties. So I think in this case, this shows that Putin was able basically to steal some of Nemtsov's thunder on the areas that mattered most electorally, where you had the largest potential pools of voters. And he basically left for Nemtsov some of the areas where there wasn't a whole lot of potential to go beyond a certain ceiling. And so, part of this has to do with campaigning. Part of this is probably a natural incumbent advantage that any incumbent has. But of course, Putin doesn't have any ordinary incumbent advantage. He had a lot of other resources at his disposal, including control over television, to put out this message and really connect with voters. So I think that this issue co-optation, the co-optation of key issues that might have worked for Nemtsov wound up being supported by the pro-Putin television and manipulation of alternatives in the political arena to basically keep Nemtsov at a certain level politically that in the end he was not able to recover from, especially as Russia's political space closed. So I think with that I'll conclude and look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for our public discussion and Q&A, and then I do want to underline that you're all very warmly invited to modest reception, which will be out in the hall, and at that time you can also ask any of our panelists some more questions or enter into discussion. First, happy to take questions and comments from the floor.
Hi, thank you very much.
Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Steve Myers from the New York Times. Thank you for this event tonight. I wanted to drill down a little bit, Mr. Hale, on the election and then the survey results, because already by 2003, the parliamentary election was certainly impacted by administrative resources, but also probably there's pretty good evidence of fraud. So did Putin steal Nemtsov's thunder as much as steal his votes? And if they had gotten over the 5% threshold SPS, could he have continued to have made a case more as a sort of system opposition that would allow these views to get out? Because really kind of the question I have about your numbers, which I have no reason to doubt at all, did those reflect the popularity of his views or the views that he represented as much as the kind of the oppression of the system?
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand?
Yeah, I think so.
Very much.
Should I go ahead and take it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Certainly by 2003 there was a lot of electoral manipulation that was going on, but it wasn't as wholesale, I think, as it later became, obviously. In that particular, United Russia in that election only, didn't get a majority of the vote. It only got about 38%, if I remember right. But that isn't to say that it was a completely level playing field. But what this is analyzing really is survey data. So we're analyzing who people said they've actually voted for. And so there wasn't a huge discrepancy there between, we didn't find that a larger percentage of people said they voted for Nemtsov than actually turned up in the, or for SPS than were reported in the official results. So in this particular case, I think it's just, we're looking at what people said about their own political behavior and trying to analyze that. I didn't look at the actual vote totals. These are just who people actually tell the survey agencies that they voted for. And I don't think by that point in time there was much sort of self-censorship on that point. I don't think there was a general fear at that point of people telling surveyors that they were voting one way or other for somebody unlike Putin. But I definitely think that, had the circumstances been different, he could well have emerged. I'm not sure that he was the right person to have led a pro-market, pro-liberal ticket in the end, just because he had been discredited a lot in many public's eyes through the problems of the 1990s. There were a lot of other people alongside Putin who were very willing to criticize him. Yabloko, of course, the liberals were unable to unite during that point, at that point in time. So he had a lot of critics, even within the pro-market, pro-Western camp, along with Putin. And then one of the things I didn't mention there, of course, was that his own party was ultimately split over whether or not they should really be supporting Putin. Putin had supported Union of Right Forces in 1999 to basically kind of help it get its parliamentary representation of that year. So I think they were very, very conflicted. So the short answer is I don't doubt that without the manipulation of the electoral scene, he would have done better, probably would have gotten a parliamentary delegation, but I don't think he would have
been probably in position to have led a very successful pro-Western force at that time.
Hi there, Francisco Alvarez with the Roosevelt Institute. Although I'm coming out of personal interest, I wanted to tease out a little bit more the question of the pro-business or pro-market groups that did not come out in support of Nemtsov. When you mean pro-business in the Russian context, what exactly are you referring to, and how do you square that? How do you square that pro-business term with the other considerable state-run industries in Russia, and then how do you square it within the political economy that the Putin administration has adopted over the past few years? Thank you.
Okay.
Let's collect a few more questions. The first one I saw was in the back there. Yep.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for the discussion. It was a pleasure. My name is Evan. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm here at personal interest, though. And this is a question for the panel. So, with elections to the State Duma scheduled for the fall, are Nemtsov's successors and supporters optimistic that PONARS can gain traction in Russia's more liberal, youthful, and urban centers?
Well,
this is a question for both Henry and Andrey. So we have essentially like modern political liberalism comes out of the time of the French Revolution, and probably the most famous Russian liberal of all time was Pierre Bezukhov. And so we have the Decembrists, the cadets, about a century later, and now essentially these pro-Western liberals. None of these groups have really sort of had traction. And so essentially, what is the future maybe of Russian liberalism? And to maybe ask a more specific question, is the natural size of Russian liberals amongst the electorate about 5 to 10%? Or is there some mechanism by which you would be more? Thank you. Oh, and Yuval Weber, Higher School of Economics and Davis Center.
I think the first question will be perfect for the reception. George?
So I'm Joe Tedeshvili, I'm Carnegie
second.
Scholar. I'm Joe Tedeshvili, Carnegie Scholar, Georgetown University. So I want to pick up on the phrase that Andrey made about time of opportunity, decade of opportunity, and the point of Henry about the downfall of Nemtsov, which started actually before Putin, and like not Putin, but himself actually responsible. So I just want to remind all of us that he was formally dismissed in 1998 because of the crisis. So by Yeltsin government, maybe Yeltsin didn't want it, but the fact is that. So I personally believe, and then but I'm really curious whether you agree that he was betrayed by Yeltsin and his government, maybe under the pressure of Berezovsky, under the pressure of the corrupt oligarchs. And I think that this fact is very eloquent attestation to how Russia used this decade of opportunity. And if so, because of Russia failed 90s, okay, that was the background on which Putin rose, and he capitalized on the failures, and because he made the case of strong state Russia actually standing up on its knees again. And so I believe that it is the 90s and the previous government which betrayed Nemtsov, and it's very unfortunate in my opinion. So I just was curious how they think about it.
Andrey?
Well, I will start with this 5-10% question. What is the electoral niche for Russian, let's say, liberals? Although I would not kind of label all Russian liberals pro-Western. Yes, this is, of course, in many respects, this holds true, but not necessarily. Well, I think it's very contextual question, and it relates to the decade of 1990s. Because my very intuitive and maybe non-academic argument would be that those people who were able to take as much opportunities of 1990s to take advantage of this decade of relative freedom, while they are still on the liberal side. So this is exactly 5, 10, maybe a little bit more percent of people who do not share many of Putin's, the key nodal points of his, including Ukraine, including many other things. Whether it's 5 or 10%, I think it's empirical question. So I don't know about figures, but definitely there is a linkage between these who are able to, how shall I say, capitalize on these opportunities of 1990s and the anti-Putin part of, or let's say Putin skeptical part of the society. On the betrayal, I don't think that this was a betrayal, because Yeltsin, to the best of my knowledge, he played a classical game of uncertainty with the whole idea of succession, and the procedure of succession was, very much influenced by, let's say, informal members of his inner circle, including the tycoons and oligarchs, which you have mentioned. So I think Yeltsin was playing this game, and that's how Putin came to the picture, to some extent, as a result of different compromises. What I would add to that is that concerning the decade of 1990s, and this is a kind of a little bit of criticism from my side to Nemtsov as a governor in Nizhny Novgorod. When he was appointed the first vice prime minister in Moscow, well, in fact, he to some extent abandoned Nizhny. He did not care very much about succession. And that's why after Nemtsov, the whole political system in Nizhny Novgorod kind of, was going through, this times of upheavals and ebbs and flows. And Nizhny ended up with the governorship of Shantsev, who was from Moscow. So it's a classical example of external governance for a region that kind of was losing this, this democratic momentum. So that's how the opportunities of 1990s were, to some extent, lost in Nizhny.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Maybe I'll take Yuval's question about kind of the 5 or 10% ceiling first, just because I think it gets at some of the broader issues, including some that Andrey has already touched on. I don't think that is a ceiling, and I don't think it was a ceiling. I think if you look at public opinion in Russia, you can word questions in ways that get lots of different kinds of results. But among what you can find support for in Russia, and you've consistently been able to find support for, majorities support a market economy as opposed to the status quo or return to socialism. Majorities, if you ask them, not what they think, whether they think, for example, the West is an enemy or something like that, but if you ask them how should Russia treat the West, majorities will say that they should treat the West as an ally. Rather than maybe not a friend, but not as an enemy or even as a rival. That's weakened a little bit since 2014, but actually hasn't altered wholesale. There's majority support that's been documented in opinion polls for long periods of time that people agree with the statement that competition among political parties makes our system stronger. So certain democratic attributes. And if you just ask them outright, do you support democracy for Russia, or do you think that democracy would work well in Russia? Large percentages, more than not, would say yes. You can also ask them, well, do you think a strong hand that ignores parliament and elections works well in Russia? And they'll say yes. But I've looked into that, and people still want to elect that strong hand. They don't want it to be appointed by God. They don't think that that person should be appointed by the predecessor or something like that. So they just want somebody to take care of things for them. But they do want the population to have control over it, and I think that they want more intervention in this by the state in the economy, but they basically want a market economy. And so I think that again, it depends on exactly how you define pro-Western liberalism, but I think it's far more than a 15% ceiling, and I think that there are probably two things that have held it back in Russia. And one, I think, is in fact problems and just contingencies, mistakes that were made on the side of the liberals. I have an article that I published several years ago where I make the case that, in fact, I think Yabloko more than SPS was the kind of hope. It was the case that they had a real chance of becoming a significant and major player in the Russian parliamentary scene. And it was basically undone by the events of 1999, in particular the apartment bombings. Yabloko was attracting major political figures to its party list, including Sergei Stepashin, former prime minister. This was adding gravitas to its party list. But then the apartment bombings happened in Chechnya, and basically the party couldn't agree on how to respond. And I think they might have been able to get a peace vote of some kind. I mean, polls showed that about 20% of people opposed the military operation, but neither Yavlinsky or Stepashin very much didn't want to take a position opposing the military operation in Chechnya. Whereas Yavlinsky, I think maybe in his heart of hearts did, but came up with some kind of crazy halfway solutions, such as, well, we need to give him an ultimatum and then bomb him over. And it just generated all this discord, and you see their ratings go down, whereas the previous summer it was looking like they could finish a very strong third place. Then after that, they got caught up by taking financing from Khodorkovsky and getting caught up in Russia's political system. But I think they would have been in a stronger position to resist Putin's political manipulations had they had a much stronger support in '99. But of course, the big factor, of course, is Putin. And I think one of their big misfortunes was that you had a very strong incumbent who came along, and this is also a misfortune for SPS, that basically you had a very strong incumbent that was intent on taking votes on some of these same positions, including pro-market positions, and including taking credit for the economic growth that had occurred. So the Nemtsov reformers thought that they should be getting credit for the growth because they had done the reforms that basically made it possible. And you had the devaluation, which gave a kickstart to growth. But that message was very hard to get out when you had a strong incumbent that was controlling media and increasingly manipulating the political system in a lot of ways that made it hard to gain traction. Sorry, I went on kind of long for that, but maybe just very briefly on the question of the oligarch or the people who are identifying with big business and small business. I mean, basically that question was they gave people a list of social groups and asked which ones of these do you feel close to. And so we were looking at people who identified small or big business as groups to which they themselves personally felt close to. And so that was like with the younger generation was one of those. Although there was also a policy question that asked them, what should Russia do with the oligarchs? Should you basically let them alone, keep everything they have? Should you just tax them at a higher rate and otherwise leave them alone? Should you take away their property? Or should you take away their property and throw them in jail? And so there's some attitudinal questions as well. And those also didn't seem to be correlated with support for him, even though he was often sort of tarred with the idea that, well, he's just kind of a stooge for Russian big business. That didn't seem to be how voters were viewing him.
It seems indicative that neither of you responded to the question about the prospects of PONARS.
That's what I wanted to say. Maybe a couple of remarks on that. I don't have an answer to this question. I just have a couple of remarks. And the first is much will depend on how they would deal with Yabloko, whether we can expect a coalition, which in other circumstances just failed, and that was very detrimental to all potential members of this coalition. We do need to take into account the kind of internal dynamics in the Yabloko party, because Yavlinsky seems to be ready for running for presidency. At least that's what I have seen many times in the media. And there is one more thing. One of the debated issues in the recent weeks is a new kind of pro-business party led by Boris Nemtsov, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a kind of pro-Kremlin project. The question is, what would be a strategy of the Kremlin, and what stands behind this, this launching of project of creating a new kind of pro-business, potentially kind of a second edition of this Pravый Del or the Right Cause Party with different names and maybe different programs, but still kind of oriented to this, pro-business and potentially pro-liberal segments in society. It's a big question mark to me.
Just one quick comment. I think that's a very interesting question. Of course, PONARS people are very optimistic because you'd have to be optimistic or crazy to try and compete in these conditions. But I think one thing that would give them hope, if you look at the Moscow mayoral elections of 2013, when Navalny, was allowed to run, people assumed that he wouldn't, especially Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, assumed that he wouldn't get many votes at all, but he was able to run what looked more or less like a traditional Western-style campaign, where he went out and talked to people and, rounded up votes, and he got 27%. So I think that shows that if the system was allowed to operate under more or less free conditions, that there would be a room for a party like PONARS, and that it could probably get a considerable amount of vote, maybe not a majority, but a good plurality. So I think in that sense, looking at Navalny's experience, it suggests that there is hope for that way.
And we have a new head of Central Electoral Committee, by the way. I would not exaggerate the importance of that, but just one of the elements of the dynamics.
All right. I would love to have our panelists continue to answer your questions, but I also want to have the opportunity to invite you to a reception just outside and down the hall. So please take your questions and comments to them while you enjoy some food and beverages. And please join me again in thanking all of our panelists.